Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia's economy has seemingly outperformed expectations and has continued to reap substantial profits from its oil and gas exports, despite a barrage of Western sanctions. However, according to Russia's draft budget for the next 2 years, Russian energy revenues are expected to fall 14%, and even this could be optimistic. So, in this video, we're going to look at why Russia has continued to reap oil and gas revenues up until now, why they're expected to decline, and how bad things might get for the Kremlin. Who's more influential, Vladimir Putin or Mark Zuckerberg? Cast your vote and help form our official ranking by clicking the link in the description. So, the first thing to make clear is that, contrary to what you might expect, Russia's energy revenues have held up remarkably well since Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Of course, Europe was Russia's main customer for oil and gas exports before the invasion. Back then, Europe accounted for about 75% of Russia's gas exports, and Russian pipelines accounted for over 40% of Europe's gas imports, with some countries, like Austria and Latvia, relying on Russia for over 80% of their gas. While the EU took steps to reduce its reliance on Russian energy imports after the invasion, including a ban on seaborne crude oil imports and a $60 per barrel price cap, these measures were only somewhat successful. While the EU successfully reduced its imports of Russian pipeline gas by about 80%, the Kremlin continued to generate significant revenue from energy exports. In fact, according to the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, Russia's energy revenues actually increased in 2022, and while they fell slightly in 2023, they were still basically at the same level as 2021. All in all, according to the Russia Fossil Tracker, Russia has amassed approximately 819 billion euros from fossil fuel exports since the invasion, which has allowed the Kremlin to continue financing its war in Ukraine. So, why have these Western measures apparently done so little in hindering Russia's energy revenues? Well, it's in part because a handful of European countries, including Czechia, Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, and Bulgaria, were at least partially exempt from the sanctions placed on Russian exports, namely gas. It's also in part because a number of European countries have taken advantage of loopholes in the sanction regimes, which prohibit direct Russian oil imports but place no restrictions on purchases of petroleum products from non-sanctioned countries that are processing or refining Russian crude, which is why European imports of petroleum products from countries like Turkey and India have dramatically increased. There are also no restrictions on European imports of Russian liquefied natural gas, which reached an all-time high in 2024, partially offsetting the decline in Russian pipeline imports. But the main reason is that the sanctions-related disruption to energy trade pushed up oil and gas prices across the world, which meant that, even if Russia was selling at a discount, as long as it could find willing buyers, it could make good money. And, well, finding willing buyers for oil and gas isn't really very difficult, because oil and gas are both absolutely central to modern economies. Following the European embargo on Russian oil, Russia was able to quickly shift its exports to Asia, especially India and China. In November, China bought 47% of Russia's crude exports, followed by India, which accounted for 37%. Russian oil now accounts for a remarkable 40% of India's total oil imports, compared to less than 1% before the war. However, 2025 could well be the year that Russia's oil and gas revenues finally dry up, or at least decrease significantly. The Kremlin itself is forecasting energy revenues to fall by 14% in the next 2 years, and there are a couple of reasons to think this forecast is a tad optimistic from Putin's perspective. As we see it, there are at least 3 reasons why revenues are expected to fall. First, global oil prices will probably fall. Secondly, Russia is at a significant disadvantage over its ongoing dispute with China over gas pricing. And third, a gas transit deal with Ukraine has officially expired, which will completely cease Russia's gas exports to Europe via Ukraine. Let's start with the first and most important reason, which is that global oil prices, which are the main determinant of the Kremlin's fiscal fortunes, are expected to fall in 2025. The World Bank, for instance, predicts that oil prices will drop from the current $80 per barrel of Brent crude to an average of $73 per barrel in 2025, which would mean about $60 per barrel for Russia, once we take into account the sanctions discount. This is mostly due to China's ongoing economic crisis, which will mean weaker demand, but also because the World Bank expects OPEC+, the international cartel of oil exporting states, to increase supply, as countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia unwind their voluntary production cuts, which were supposed to increase global prices but haven't really worked. It's not mentioned in the World Bank's report, but there's also some speculation that Trump's pro-oil agenda, encapsulated in his campaign slogan of "Drill, baby, drill," could further loosen supply. This is one of the reasons that other analysts see prices falling even further. Analysts at Opis, for instance, think that oil prices could drop to $30 to $40 per barrel if OPEC+ fails to coordinate the coming production cuts. Such a drop would push Russia's budget deficit, which stands at around 0.5% of GDP, to around 3% of GDP, which would be difficult to maintain given the lack of available credit. Anyway, the second reason is China. In short, while China has stepped up as Russia's main energy importer, they're stuck in an ongoing dispute over gas pricing. For context, when Europe stopped importing Russian pipeline gas, there was a hope in Moscow that Russia would be able to redirect some of these exports to China via a new pipeline called the Power of Siberia 2. China already receives some Russian gas via the first Power of Siberia pipeline, which began operating in 2019, and has a maximum annual capacity of 38 billion cubic meters, but this is a far cry from the 200 billion cubic meters Russia used to export to Europe. The Power of Siberia 2 was supposed to have a capacity of 50 billion cubic meters, but 2 years in, and construction hasn't even started yet. According to a report from the Financial Times, this is because China is demanding unpalatably low prices from Gazprom, presumably because China already has a diversified pipeline supply and a large LNG import potential, while Russia has less options, and therefore sort of needs China as a reliable export market. Third, Russian gas revenues will also take a hit in 2025 following the expiration of a gas transit agreement between Ukraine and Russia at the end of last year. The deal had previously allowed the Russian state energy giant, Gazprom, to pump natural gas through Ukraine's Brotherhood pipeline, and its expiration will cost Gazprom, which suffered a 600 billion ruble loss in 2023, about $7 to $8 billion in lost revenues, accounting for about 10% of Russia's gas exports. Ultimately, a lot here depends on how global prices develop over the coming months. While no one can see the future, the fact that oil prices have remained relatively low despite escalating geopolitical turbulence in the Middle East, plus the various downside risks we've just described, all bode ill for Moscow.
There's a lot of difficult decisions necessary here, and making huge decisions, especially quickly, is difficult, even for world leaders. The good thing is that brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data, programming, and AI. Their interactive classes can help build your critical thinking skills through problem solving, not memorizing. So while you're building real knowledge on specific topics, you'll also be becoming a better thinker. For instance, their Predicting with Probability course can help you better understand and assess the world around you. You can learn to wrangle massive data sets, compare distributions, and master fundamental concepts like Bayes' theorem. Now that might sound a little technical, but with their active learning, you'll learn this by answering questions like, which airline is most likely to have a delay due to weather? And how much more unruly have airline passengers gotten since the pandemic? Data skills are absolutely necessary for navigating our modern world, and Brilliant is the best way to get them. So try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/TLDR, or by clicking the link in the description. And by doing so, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.